this is really interesting. So I'm going to talk for a minute about solar and the solar moratorium that many, if not all of you, are probably aware that the town considered last year, which might seem to be a little tangential to talking about power plants today, but it's pretty telling. So last year, the town board considered adopting a moratorium on ground-mounted commercial solar projects while they took a pause to come up with new zoning specific to those kinds of projects. Ultimately, the moratorium was never voted on, but there was a resolution that was discussed at several board meetings. The reason that the town wanted to consider this moratorium was that the solar energy facilities are not currently regulated under the town's zoning code. Interesting. So commercial solar facilities are not considered, apparently, utility company structures, because utility company structures are, of course, regulated under the code. If a commercial solar facility, whether that's at the distribution level or selling into the grid like GlidePath is, if those aren't utility company structures, and I think most, if not all of us would agree that generally speaking, solar projects have far less community and environmental harmful impacts than a gas-fired power plant, then it would make no sense at all for the town to consider a similarly sized gas-fired power plant as a utility company structure that is currently regulated under the code. So what does this mean? This means that the town of Ulster needs to step up and say, GlidePath, no, what you've been saying is not correct. You've been out there telling people that, hey, we're in the office and manufacturing district, we're allowed to build our plant there. No, they are not. So today, Sienna Hudson and our coalition partners, Kingston Citizens, Citizens for Local Power, Riverkeeper, Sierra Club, Hudson River Sloop Clearwater, who am I missing? Someone, I'm sure.
That's good.
But I think I got them all. We sent a letter to the town of Ulster. Oh, I'm sorry, Catskill Mountain Keeper. Thank you, Kathy. I knew I would forget somebody. Last but certainly not least. We sent a letter to the town board saying, GlidePath is out there saying that this is a permitted use in this zone. We don't think it is. Town of Ulster, please step up and say publicly what your interpretation of the zoning code is. Are you intending to allow small peaker power plants in any zone within the town? That makes no sense. And that's essentially what we said in our letter. And so we're urging other folks within the town of Ulster to write today to the town board. And there is a sign-on letter, I believe, at the town of Ulster table, in the back of the room, where you can sign on and add your name to a letter from the town of Ulster citizens saying, Town of Ulster, we don't think this is a permitted use in this zone, and we want you to stand up and say so. Or if the town disagrees and they really think that they should be allowing power plants in every district within the town, well, we'll force their hand and make them say that too, but I doubt they'll want to do that. So folks from the town of Ulster can sign that letter, and we are also asking in this letter for the town to acknowledge that their current zoning does not regulate power plants and ask them to implement a moratorium on power plants within the town while they consider where and if at all they want power plants to be sited within the town. And so we've got that action ready for folks in the town of Ulster today. We urge you to take it, sign on to the letter, write your own letter, go to a town board meeting. This is something really important that you can do, and you can do it now while the seeker process is kind of going through its process. The town can absolutely take this action at this point in time. But that's not all. What if you don't live in the town of Ulster? You don't have this precise problem with the zoning code that folks in Ulster do. You may not have, good for you, a GlidePath proposal in your neighborhood, but you need to ensure that you don't end up with a similar peaker plant like this in your backyard. Rebecca said, and Mike Hines said, and Evelyn just said, it isn't just the town of Ulster. You guys happened to be first, but these plants are coming. They're coming to other towns in the Hudson Valley for all of the reasons that Evelyn so eloquently just went over. It's a perfect place for somebody who wants to build one of these smaller facilities that is under primarily local jurisdiction, not the state Article 10 process, but primarily local land use law governs these projects to come into the Hudson Valley and build one of these. It's pretty lucrative at this point in time. And most municipalities don't currently have any zoning in place to address these plants. One reason might be they've just never seen them before, but another is I think there's a misconception that these plants are regulated by state law, and it's not something that local municipalities have control over. And if it's less than 25 megawatts, they really have the primary jurisdiction. So what all the rest of you can do is to urge your municipality, before they get the next GlidePath proposal, to place a moratorium on power plants within their town, a temporary zoning moratorium, while they consider appropriate zoning for power plants in your town. Rather than exploiting some vagaries within the code, the way that GlidePath has here in the town of Ulster, you want your town to be proactive, to implement that moratorium, to look at the zoning, to look at the town and say, do we want to allow power plants at all in our town? And if we do, where do we want to allow them? And let's be really specific about it. And one question that you'll often see is, well, should we allow these plants at all? Wouldn't that be illegal? Wouldn't that be impermissible exclusionary zoning? Aren't we supposed to allow any use somewhere as long as it's lawful? And the answer to that is not necessarily in New York. In New York, there's never been a case law that has stated that any industrial use must be allowed somewhere within a municipality. In fact, the highest court in the state of New York has repeatedly, specifically said that the exclusionary zoning rules that do apply to residential zoning that are really aimed at not zoning out low-income housing, multifamily housing, those sorts of things, those rules don't apply to commercial uses. And that if a town decides with a strong basis in fact that a certain use is not consistent with the town's values and the other land uses going on within the town, there's nothing to say that they could not zone out power plants completely. So that's one thing your town could do if they're willing to step up and do that. Not every town may be, and they may be exposing themselves to potential litigation, which I think they would win, but a lot of towns aren't really hungry for that sort of thing. So if they're not prepared to zone out power plants altogether, they should regulate them extremely strictly. And they absolutely have the power to do that. And the first thing they should do, which is actually not on my slide, is they should very specifically define the kinds of electric generating facilities that they need to regulate. One suggestion would be that they limit it to energy generation facilities that are not using renewable resources. A lot of towns right now are considering solar zoning codes, and I think that solar and wind should be considered different than a traditional gas-fired or oil-burning power plant. So you should define that it's using non-renewable fuels. You should put a size threshold. Maybe it's 1 megawatt or more. So something that's really a tiny use might not get lumped in with the extremely restrictive zoning. And finally, maybe it's only for off-site use. So if there's a small power cogeneration project that's supplying an industrial use that's already existing, maybe that's not subject to these very strict rules that are really aimed at those new power plants. They should be limited to the heaviest industrial zones that are not close to residences, that are not close to important environmental areas, and that are appropriate for uses that generate a lot of noise, a lot of traffic, a lot of pollution, away from where people are, away from sensitive environmental resources. They should require a special use permit, which goes above and beyond allowing something as of right. They should have strict conditions. They should have minimum lot size and coverage. They should just very specifically think about how they want these plants to be sited and where they should go and under what conditions. And finally, and very importantly, they should require for any power plant an enforceable decommissioning plan that requires when that power plant goes out of business, it needs to be completely decommissioned and the site restored to its original condition or even better condition. So that wraps up the zoning discussion, and I know that's sort of a lot to digest, but we've got a really important action for folks in the town of Ulster to take right now today That letter will get sent in really soon and will echo the one that the coalition partners sent in today. And if you're not in the town of Ulster, I really urge you to talk to your town about the pressure that they're going to see from peaking power plants, and that they shouldn't be caught unawares and back on their heels and be victim the way that the town of Ulster has been. They should proactively think about how they want to deal with these things. And then I'd like to just very quickly give an update, or kind of a non-update, on the secret process, since that's the environmental review that we're currently undergoing for this plant, and I know people are eager to know what's going on, when can we expect the next steps, what can we do in the meantime. So very quickly, GlidePath is currently in the process of doing all its studies and drafting its draft environmental impact statement. We've heard from GlidePath that they expect that will be released in the fourth quarter of 2018, so maybe then, maybe a little later, but sometime this winter if all goes according to GlidePath's plan. But before they release it publicly for public comment, the town of Ulster, who's the lead agency under SECR for this project, has to approve their DEIS as adequate and complete. So in the meantime, there will be sort of back channel back and forth between the town and GlidePath as the town reviews draft environmental impact statements and determines whether they're adequate, and if not, gives feedback to GlidePath to ensure that it's adequate. But once the town makes that decision and the document is public, and it will be published on the environmental notice bulletin, and you'll all surely receive notice that it's out there, that will trigger a really important public comment period, potentially the most important public comment period for this project. And that public comment period must be a minimum of 30 days. And 30 days for a project like this is not a lot of time. It's not nearly enough time. Fortunately, there's no maximum time period, and quite often lead agencies will grant more than 30 days even at the get-go, but you absolutely can and should request more time. And they also may, but are not required to, hold a public hearing on the project. So when that DEIS is released, there are two kind of immediate things to do before you even get into the substance and get into the specific comments. One is make sure you've got enough time to comment. If they say 30 days, if they say 60 days, you need to make sure that there's adequate time for comment, at least 90 days, and also request at least one public hearing. It's so important that folks see the people turn out and give their statements orally and not just in writing. That's a lot more impactful when it's done that way. And that wraps it up for my presentation today.
Well done.
Evelyn, can I ask you to come up? Great. Okay, so we're going to do some questions now. I'm going to come around with the microphone and get to as many as we can. Before we do, I want to say that any Town of Ulster citizens who are here, Laura Hartman is in the back, Laura, and with the letter that we would love to collect Town of Ulster citizen signatures to deliver to the town board meeting next Thursday. So as many signatures as we can get tonight and pile it on throughout the week. And if you're interested in helping Laura and the citizens in the back get signatures of neighbors, we do have some signature sheets. So we want to really jam and get that done for Thursday. There's also GlidePath signs too for sale, and Laura will help you with that. So questions?
Thanks. I'm a carpetbagger from Marbletown, but I come to Ulster a lot, and I sure as hell don't want to breathe that stuff. 200,000 people a year in the U.S. die from fossil fuel pollution, according to an MIT study. Now, we tried to do solar at SUNY New Paltz in the 70s, and the powers that be sabotaged it, basically. And the argument against solar has always been, well, what do you do when the sun doesn't shine? So batteries are awesome for solar. Why can't they build that thing? I did a little calculation once. If they put solar panels on 6 of those malls in that area, they could generate 20 megawatts. Why the hell can't they use solar power that's a natural for battery technology? Thank you.
Okay, actually, this is a great format. If you could say your name and where you're from, then we'll know what we're looking at here tonight. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mary Farron, and I'm from Carroll in Green County. I wanted to clarify or verify what you say, that any plant under 25 megawatts can be under the municipal jurisdiction. Does it have to be?
Yes, under 25 megawatts is not regulated by New York State Article 10.
Thank you. And, okay, because I'm working on the Sheridan Hollow plant up in Albany, and that's under 25 megawatts, and I don't think it's the city that's working on it, so thank you.
It could be a different lead agency for the seeker process, but the land use permits will all be local. It's not under Article 10.
Thank you, Mary.
No problem. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you and everyone here for making this informative panel option available. My name is Lauren. I'm from the town of Kingston. And I have a question. Is the list of announcing and informing the town board available either in print or on email or online so that I could make them aware of what's happening here?
In terms of the letter that was sent today?
No, the idea of future preparations for the event of a plant being even considered.
Oh, absolutely. We can make that public. I can make the presentation public, and we hope to actually develop some more specific language. We haven't yet, but we hope to very soon develop some more specific language that I think would be even more helpful to you in going to your town. But certainly can share the presentation today with everyone on the Kingston Citizens listserv.
Right, so if you're not on our newsletter, you could go to kingstoncitizens.org. There's a sign up for the newsletter. There's also a sign up in the back. We're going to be creating a toolkit, which will have the video, which will have the PowerPoint presentations, step-by-step what to do in your community. So, you're welcome.
Hi, I'm Alan Goldhammer from Minnesota. 2 questions. One is there going to have to build another pipe to fire this plant? That's one. No, okay. Second question is about batteries. You said the batteries aren't quite up to 4 hours worth of providing power.
No, that's not what I meant. I meant if the battery spec is 4 hours, I don't know if they feel comfortable guaranteeing that they'll be available for 4 hours every time.
Then you draw less power off the batteries for a longer time, kilowatt hours or kilowatt hours. So they could be rated less, and they could change the rating if the regulations change.
Right,
yes?
and I think that's what the ISO is actually going to let them do. That's what they're talking about now, is actually sticking with the 4 hours, but letting them say what percentage availability they're going to have.
Hi, Johannes Sayer from Kingston. I think there's a vision thing here, which I certainly want to keep in my mind as part of this conversation. In the developing world, we see huge cities forming, becoming ever larger, and they basically serve as camps for wage slaves. I think that's a reasonable way to characterize it. Here we have the new urbanism, which is a positive vision of concentration of resources and consumers of those resources in well-formed urban areas. What this sounds like, it reminds me of the sequel to Blade Runner, which I just saw, for anyone who's not of my generation, our generation. It's a science fiction movie about a post-nuclear, post-environmental world. In that movie, they made San Diego the garbage dump for Los Angeles. What this sounds like to me is that in concentric rings, as you described it, in concentric rings around the megacity of your choice, is where the garbage is going to be put and the resources are going to be exploited to support that city with its socioeconomic hierarchy, with the rich living at the top and clean air, and the wage slaves living down in the garbage. So there's a fundamental question here about, do we have a decentralized society, do we have decentralized infrastructure, where power generation is ubiquitous, or is it planned in dubious ways and centralized? So, little editorial comment. Thank you very much for listening.
Coming back here.
My name is Jenny Snyder. I live in Kingston now, but I was a long-time resident of Long Island City, where there was a Con Ed plant and towers, smokestacks right next to many, many housing projects. So I understand the point you were making before about housing in neighborhoods that plants in neighborhoods least able to deal with the effects. I'm wondering if there, in terms of this partnering idea that you mentioned, that there was any cooperation between an upstate town and a city neighborhood that is facing those issues, where they could work together to create clean energy for both neighborhoods.
That's a really interesting idea. I'm not aware of any, but I think that'd be something interesting to pursue. I know, for some of those power plants, they really need the capacity right there, and that's why they have the idea of building batteries on site there, so that the battery could do most of the work of the peaker plant and they'd hardly ever need to turn it on. But there's probably other ways in which those communities could partner with other communities. It's a great idea.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Robin Pendergrass, and I'm in Kingston. And my question is for Evelyn. I'm sorry, my question is kind of vague, but in your slideshow, I saw written something for the smart zone or smart something, and I've learned to distrust anything that has the word smart in front of it. Can you just explain that?
That's
please?
a good question, yeah. So, you know what, I even thought about that when I put that word on the slide, because I know that's a danger word for a lot of folks. So the idea is that we were talking about flexibility and the fact that when we have a lot of renewables on the system, we need the system to be more responsive to changes in solar and wind. And so one thing that can be done is just put a lot of batteries out. But another thing that can be done is use the loads that we have in a smarter way. And the best example, the most promising example is if we start having a lot of electric vehicles out there, people could, if they want to, this isn't something that would be forced on people, but you could set up your vehicle charging so that the utility could send you a signal and say, we'd really like you to stop charging right now. And so if you, and they would pay you or give you a better rate for this. And so, you could say, okay, I'm gonna only charge my vehicle in the middle of the night. For example, when the wind plants upstate are blowing, I won't try to charge it at 5 in the afternoon when I get home from work, because I know that's when the sun is going down, and that's when people are coming home from work and turning their lights on. That's the worst time to plug a vehicle in. So it's ideas like that we could start managing our electricity loads in smarter ways that would take a lot of the stress out of the system that GlidePath thinks that we're going to have here.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Bill Miller from Hurley. A good friend of mine, and this is for you guys to maybe answer in the future, was traveling in Dutchess County, and he found himself behind a large vehicle with large equipment on it going about 1 mile an hour. They were headed towards Dover, New York. Dover, New York is about as far from Poughkeepsie as we are. I don't know how they got it going there. I don't know what happened, and I don't know how many other places are happening like that, that we have to kind of get out in front of together with others. That's all I'm saying. Are there others around us like that?
Yeah, there are, and the difference is what Haley was talking about in terms of the size. A big plant, the primary regulation is done at the state level, but this 25 megawatt threshold that GlidePath is just squeaking under means that they don't get regulated at the state level. It's on the town boards, and so that's why we got to spread the word about all of this stuff and get the towns ready. Rebecca, you got a question right up here in the front too.
Yep, making my way.
You know, there's a lady right here who said she just distrusts anything that sounds smart or has the word smart in it. Well, I feel very much in the smart zone with you two up there, and I've always felt that way, and I could listen to you forever. I wish I could say the same. My name is Regis Sobojeski from the town of Ulster. I wish I could say that our town board meetings were a smart zone. I don't often feel that way, and I'm not picking on them. Yes, I am. My question is a process question. It really has to do with the seeker process, and it really is, I think, it's a beautiful process that I think is a bit slanted, it feels to me, toward lead agencies. When we were in the scoping period, okay, the final scope was submitted by the lead agency, the town of Ulster Town Board, to the applicant. There was a lot of input. There was input from you folks, from our environmental partners, from the town of Ulster Citizens.org, and I have to say that I felt that most of that great input was ignored. And we called the town board on that, and they said, hey, you have an opportunity with the DEIS, the draft environmental impact statement that's going to come maybe in the fourth quarter of 2018. And we said, wait a minute, don't conflate with what we're saying. We know there's an opportunity. We will take that opportunity. We will comment on the DEIS submitted by the applicant. What we don't want to happen is exactly what happened in the scoping process, where we were citizens, the citizen participation, demeaned because we had not, our comments and your comments were ignored. We don't want that to happen again. And I'm not sure that it won't. I'm not confident that it won't, and it seems to me that the lead agency has that power. Can you comment on that? Because it's a rather frustrating process from my point of view. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think for somebody who's participated in a lot of secret processes, it is often frustrating, although I think overall it's a good process. But the lead agency does have a certain amount of power. Ultimately, they're the decision makers. They have a certain amount of discretion. They do have to follow the law and regulations. And then if any of their decisions are challenged, they get a certain amount of deference to them. So there is a certain amount of power there. And a lot of times our local municipal entities are not as experienced with seeker and in environmental laws and regulations. On the other hand, they often know more about what's going on in their town. So it can be a frustrating experience, but I think there's a couple of things that people can do to try to make sure that there's at least the greatest chance possible that our comments and our perspectives are taken seriously. And one is to turn out loudly and turn out in numbers. And certainly we've already done that, but you know, we can do it even better. And they're forced to listen to that. Let's face it, they're elected officials. They have to respond to their constituents, and if enough people come out, they will listen. And the second is to get experts who really know what they're talking about, who are experienced, ideally folks that have worked, you know, on both sides, you know, for industry and for the sort of nonprofit and citizen group side, and have them make your arguments for you. Have expert reports that you can rely on when you have your comments on the DEIS. And it really forces them to pay attention. At the end of the day, they may or may not make the decision we want them to make. And then you've always got the choice to go to court and file an Article 78, but we all hope that doesn't happen. So we have to create the best situation possible while we've got things in the town board's hands.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sorry I had to miss some of it, but it was really excellent. I'm Pat Strong. When I'm not campaigning, I work under contract to the Energy Authority that you've been talking about, NYSERDA. But as a candidate, I don't know if I missed this. Have you had a chance to think about legislative fixes? You know, you talked about how this ultimately ends up at the town board level, but it seems like we should be able to change that at the state level with legislation.
It's a really good point. I think with any legislation, it's always sort of, you know, do we want to open that can of worms? Because things can go either way. And having had experience both with the local siting process and with Article 10, there's pros and cons to both. And I know some folks that are dealing with projects under the Article 10 process right now who wish that it was under local control and vice versa. It's the grass is always greener kind of thing. So I think there could be legislative solutions, but they would have to be very carefully thought out, and you always have to think about, you know, how it could go wrong for you.
Right. Thanks.
Rebecca, I've got a couple thoughts on that too. More from the broader energy policy point of view, a couple things. One is that I didn't get into all the complications of this, but there's more than one way that the New York ISO is getting in the way of meeting the state's clean energy goals, and they are an independent agency. The legislature doesn't have direct control over them, but they do have to follow state laws. And so I think it bears some thinking about what kind of frameworks could be put in place by the legislature. As you know, the legislature's been kind of absent on energy policy. All of this has been happening in the executive branch. You know, certainly if the legislature put some teeth into the state's carbon goals, that would change the whole landscape for everything. And I think the secret process is really out of date, and I'm probably using the wrong kinds of words for this, and Haley can help us correct them. But you know, for a long time, carbon emissions were not really taken seriously in the secret process. It was kind of like you know, you got to estimate them and report on them, but it wasn't a reason to turn a project down because, hey, everything emits carbon and, you know, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, now there are things we can do about it. And at some point, if the state's going to meet its goals, the burden of proof has to be reversed. Right now, from a carbon point of view, a project like this can get built unless there's something else wrong with it. And we need it to go the other way. You know, I'm not one of the 100% renewable people. I think we need to be smart about what we do, and I'm not sure we can get there as quickly as some other folks think we can. I love that people are pushing for it, but what I really think we need is a new burden of proof that says we're not going to permit a fossil fuel project unless we can demonstrate we really need it, and we really need it in that spot. And that's something that's got to evolve. You know, no jurisdiction in the country really has done that in a broad way yet, but that's something that the state is going to have to do to meet its goals at some point.
Hi.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, we have an announcement here, just really quickly.
Hi, my name is Vicki and I'm in charge of the food. That we have a huge amount of hamburgers and hot dog roll packets left, and we're selling them for $1 a piece. And I mean, if you want to take some hamburger and hot dog rolls home, Vince says, please take them, you know. So I just wanted to make that announcement. Plus, we also have watermelon and cookies up here, and there's still some corn on the cob and some watermelon down there also. Okay?
Thank you. This is an excellent forum. It's an excellent event, so I'm learning so much. My name is Cheryl Schneider. I live in Bloomington in the town of Rosendale. And clearly we need more capacity, renewable energy capacity. But when you go to try to build these out now, you can't get connected. Because if you're going to do community, from my understanding, if you're going to do community generation, we've got some arrays that are waiting to be interconnected, but Central Hudson won't do it. And they're saying we're going to need, again, legislative efforts and muscle to make this happen.
Yep.
So this is very frustrating because a lot of people want to build these arrays, and we could have massive amounts of self-sufficiency here. So above and beyond fighting GlidePath, what can we do about that?
Yeah, that's another really good point. Unfortunately, the Public Service Commission has put it in the utilities' hands to be the engines of innovation, and they're really not suited for that. So yeah, that's a great point. That's another place where the legislature might be able to break up the logjam.
We have a question up here. Hi, I'm Dawn Carpino from the town of Ulster, and I have a question. You had mentioned that there are many alternatives that GlidePath could do, and I'm just wondering why they don't choose to go that way.
I really don't know. I know some of you have had conversations with them. I've talked to Peter Rood several times. He comes across as super earnest and wanting to be all of our friends. It's hard to know how to take what they say. So certainly what I've run through that list with him, and NYSERDA has run through that list with him, and they have a reason why each one won't work, but not all their reasons are accurate. For example, he told me the ISO rules won't change until 2025. That's just not true. And so I don't know if they're deliberately misunderstanding those things, or if they just don't want to bother, or what. I'd like to think there is a world in which they read the writing on the wall here and they say, wow, we'd really rather switch to a cleaner alternative that we can get approved faster. I kind of have the sense that they didn't understand how long this process was going to take because they don't have any experience with it. And so I'd like to think there's a chance for them to look at the big picture and say, you know what, this is not working, let's come up with something that is. I hope that if we keep putting the pressure on, they'll get to that point, but I really don't know.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have an answer. They're trying to use up all the fossil fuels they can because they're going obsolete fast.
Hi, I'm Sue Rosenberg. I live in Saugerties, and I'm with the Coalition Against Pilgrim Pipelines. But the question I have is, what impact do you think the closing of Indian Point what impact, if any, do you think the closing of Indian Point is having on pressure to come up with alternative energy producing?
Well, I think in the short run, I think the New York ISO, who is ultimately in charge of our grid, looks at that and says, we got to get as many new gas plants on the system as we can because that's the only thing we trust. And so I think that is obscuring their view of the bigger picture. And unfortunately, I suspect that's going to keep being the case. There is a stakeholder process that the New York ISO has. Community groups can become official stakeholder members of their committees, and that may be a route that we can put more pressure on them.
And if I could just add to that, I think Evelyn's absolutely right that the closure of Indian Point, a 2,000 plus megawatt plant compared to the 20 megawatts that the Lincoln Park plant would provide, is certainly, I think, skewing the way that people at the ISO, some regulators, some citizens of the Hudson Valley are looking at things, but I think realistically, it's not really an issue. The ISO and the Public Service Commission have plans in place that have been in place for years for the closure of Indian Point. They've been preparing for this. They've seen the writing on the wall even before Governor Cuomo announced several years ago that he was going to close the plant. They saw the writing on the wall. There's been new transmission built. There's been plants that have come online in the past. And even the ISO says in its reliability reports, there's no reliability issues with Indian Point closing in 2020 and 2021, which is when they're scheduled to close. So I think it's a little bit of a red herring, but certainly is it influencing the way some folks are thinking about this? It probably is.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jürgen Weckerle. I'm from Orange County. I have a question and a few comments. if the batteries are fully charged, how many megawatts could they release?
20.
The batteries.
20, yeah.
The batteries could release 20 megawatts themselves. Yep. And the two turbines can generate 20 megawatts.
That's right.
Why is this not considered a 40 megawatt plant that's subject to Article 10?
That's a good question. My understanding, and you can probably explain this better than me, but I am not an electrical engineer at all, is that they couldn't run at the same time. It's an either-or kind of situation. The batteries are charged from the plant, not from the grid. The plant would charge the batteries. The batteries are kind of waiting there, but if the plant is running, they're both attached to one transmission line. My understanding is that they can't go at the same time, but I'm a lawyer, not an engineer. So.
Well, that is false, because we know time of day usage. So if they use the gas from their own generators at night when total usage is minimal, they will be able to sell at peak power the 40 megawatt capacity. And it's the nameplate capacity, which would then include the batteries, that should be considered. And I think that point should be made very carefully, because they talk about capacity zone and this backup insurance policy thing and peak power. Every power plant's a peak power plant anymore, because none of them are producing at capacity. But their objective appears to sell into the energy market, which gets far more money than the backup capacity market. And they will underprice any of the existing plants, especially Dance Camera and Royston and Bowline and Athens even. They will get 100% of their production accepted in the ISO auction market. So that is really what they're able to do. No matter what they say, if they're capable of doing it, count on it being done. Just to follow up on your very nice observations and of the utility issue and the zoning, one test to support your position is this plant, as it currently stands, is not regulated by the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission regulates all utilities in New York. Ergo, they're not a utility. Okay, so we have that to look at. There was something else, but that's enough for now. But I would definitely try to get an Article 10, get it out of the hands of the town board under a secret process, and go from there.
Thank you. Did you want to follow up on that?
I don't know the answer, but it's a very interesting question. Yeah, definitely we should look into it.
Okay. We have time for 2 more questions or a comment.
35 years ago, I was one of the people in Hudson Valley Green who kicked Con Edison out of Red Hook. And it took a lot of fact digging to figure out exactly what they're doing. And I see the same thing going on here with GlidePath. They're not telling the truth. There's a lot of things going on there that they're not saying. And we just have to concentrate, find their real weaknesses, and focus on them and kick them out of town.
Thank you. One more question this evening, if there is any. No.
There's a gentleman in the back left there.
Sebastian.
I'm gonna out myself as a carpetbagger as well. I'm from Littleton, Massachusetts originally, but I live in Kingston now. The town I come from has municipally owned utilities, so the electricity company and the water company are municipally owned. I'm curious if any or all, what impact having municipally owned electrical utilities in the Hudson Valley might have on these sorts of plants, and kind of envisioning what sort of a community we want to create here in Kingston and in the town of Ulster.
I would love to see that happen. In fact, I have come away from several processes involving the utilities and state level regulations. So frustrated I want to start a municipalization study group. So I've definitely been thinking along the same lines. Because of the deregulated market in New York State, it's not the utilities that build power plants. So having a municipal utility wouldn't directly impact whether this plant is located here. They're playing into the New York State market. But it certainly would allow us to do a lot of local planning around what kind of power supply we want, who we want to buy power from, and I think that would be great. You know, Citizens for Local Power spent a couple of years really intensively studying a program called Community Choice Aggregation, which also came out of Massachusetts. We thought that would be, it's a less difficult alternative to municipalization. It's a way of basically creating, you know, almost an electricity buying cooperative at the municipal level. But the way it's been set up in New York State, we can't see that we can get it to work to meet our objectives. And so, you know, municipalization is a very difficult process. It's very expensive because the municipality has to buy the whole system from the utility. But there are places in the country where it has happened recently. You know, most of the municipal utilities are old that exist, but there are, I think, I want to say Boulder recently municipalized, so it can be done, but it is not an undertaking. It's not to be undertaken lightly. Yeah.
Haley, do you want to wrap up?
Sure. I'll just remind folks that we've still got the sign-ups in the back for the letter to the Town of Ulster Board. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. Like I said, without people like you who actually show up and listen to these sorts of maybe sometimes a little boring presentations and look at what you can do in your town, in your state to make a difference, things aren't going to change. So we need folks like you to show up. Thank you all for being here. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors what they can do, and have a wonderful weekend.
Great. I want to thank Evelyn and Haley for being our panel guests tonight. Thank all of you for coming. And as I said earlier, we're going to be creating a toolkit that'll be available to everyone. That'll have all this information tonight to make it easy. We will also, we would love to, if there's any members from CACs, this is a really great thing to introduce some of these ideas to your local conservation advisory council, your planning board, your town board, your council members. So we'll be making all of that information available. And thanks to our coalition partners, there's Vince is down there cooking up a storm. It's all for you. Purchase a GlidePath sign and put it up in your neighborhood. This is another great action that you can take to help us to raise awareness. There's still lots of people who have no idea this is happening in our community. Tell a friend, and please sign up to KingstonCitizens.org to get up-to-date information on the process. Thank you.